welcome back to Friday Youth Online. We've got a really cool night planned for you guys tonight. It's going to look a little bit different. So rather than having a long Youth Online episode, we're actually just going to be hearing from Theo straight up, and then we're going to be heading onto Zoom for more of a discussion night. So Theo is going to be talking about apologetics, which he's then going to talk to us about on Zoom. So make sure you head on to Zoom after this episode because it's going to be really cool. So we'll give it over to Theo. Take it away, Theo.
Hi Grainery Youth, my name's Theo. Thanks for joining us today. I'm just going to talk to you just for a brief couple of moments about apologetics. Please don't stop the video because that sounds boring to you. It's not actually, it's quite interesting. In fact, apologetics can be lots of fun, and I'm here to tell you why. So, what is apologetics? Maybe you've heard that term before, or maybe you haven't. Apologetics is just basically where Christians come up with a logical case for the things that they believe. You know, it sort of goes beyond just what you feel or what you've experienced to making a reasoned argument. It comes from the Greek term apologia, apologia was a classical Greek term. Basically, it's something that you'd use in a law court. Okay, so if you think about a legal court today, and someone basically makes a claim against someone in ancient Greek, the prosecution was called the categoria, and so they make an accusation like, this is true or this isn't true or whatever, and then the defendant would reply with the apologia, that is the defense. So if we think about apologetics, it's basically where Christians make a logical defense for the things that they believe. Now, why is this important? Well, a lot of Christians turn to 1 Peter for their their biblical justification for why they even do apologetics in the first place. So, in case you don't know, 1 Peter 3:15 says, "But in your hearts set Christ apart as holy and acknowledge him as Lord. Always be ready to give a logical defense to anyone who asks you to account for the hope that is in you, but do it courteously and respectfully." So I just want to quickly talk about 3 different aspects of that verse, and then we'll be done. So the first part is that it says in that verse about setting in your hearts, set Christ apart as holy. So apologetics, firstly, is about your own heart. Okay, often, we think of it in terms of 2 people having a debate. So you might have a Christian apologist debating an atheist about whether or not there's a God. And so we think about it as being an argument between 2 people. And we'll get to that in a sec. But I think apologetics should start off as something which has an effect in your own heart individually. And certainly that was the case for me. In my early 20s, when I started going to university and doing my undergraduate degree, I had been a Christian pretty much all my life, and I had experiences, and I had an understanding of God, and I knew a fair bit about the Bible, I suppose. But I had not come at my faith yet at that place from a really philosophical or, rational point of view. And when I was at university, suddenly I was surrounded by people who didn't believe Christianity, but also had very logical, rational reasons for why they didn't. And so suddenly I was confronted with the fact that, can what I believe actually stand up against these arguments? And that's when I first really started to discover the world of Christian apologetics. And I think that was really important for me looking back, because that was actually the time when I was able to start to really think about, what do I believe and does it make sense? And listen to Christian apologists and the arguments, the good reasoned arguments that they make for Christian belief. And as I started to think through them and to ponder them myself and have discussions with other people, I started to take on a faith which was really my own. I'd been raised in a Christian home, going to a Christian school, been in church. So my Christianity was very much formed by other people who were older than me most of the time. But through engaging with Christian apologetics, I was able to come up with a faith that was my own. And so I think for you who are watching, you should be interested for that reason, because it's a chance for you to actually go, what do I really believe? And make your faith your own through looking at some of the arguments for Christianity. Now, I used to think that, like at that time of my life when I was starting to really question what I believed, I thought, my general feeling was that believing in God was weird, and that the normal thing to do was just to assume that there wasn't a God, because, it's like you can't see him, and everyone seems to have a different opinion about who he is, so it didn't seem to me to be obvious. So I just kind of felt like, believing in God as a Christian was kind of made me weird. But as I've done a little bit more research about the world and about history, I've seen that actually the norm has been, for most people through most periods of history, to believe in God. That's the norm. And so really we live in a time when secularism, and that's basically just the absence of a belief in God, has become much more popular. But mostly through history, believing in God has been the norm. In fact, even now in Australia, over half the population, according to the census, claim to be Christians, which means that they would believe in God. And that's just the Christians. There's all the people in Australia who aren't Christians, but they still believe in God because they are part of some other kind of religion. Or they mightn't believe in the same God that we believe in, but they have a belief in the divine, that there's some kind of greater reason or truth behind the universe than just the materialistic, what we can see. And in the book of Romans, it speaks into this. It says in Romans chapter 1, verse 18, "But God shows his anger from heaven against all sinful, wicked people who suppress the truth by their wickedness." I'm going to go on beyond that. In verse 19, it says, "They know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power, and his divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God." Okay, so Romans 1 says to us that in the world, it's very obvious that there is a God, that the whole world points us to the fact that there is a God. Now, how does that work? Well, when I was in school, I remember I had a teacher that said that every time he looks at a tree, he sees God's thumbprint. And that used to confuse me as a kid, because I'd sort of look at a tree and try and see God's thumbprint and assume that God had very scaly thumbs or something like that. And I didn't quite sort of understand what was being said there. And I think it's not just saying that because trees are so well made, or because a skyline could be so beautiful, that's how we know there's a God, implying that somehow if trees looked like they'd been done by a 3-year-old or something, or skies were like just all one block colour all the time, that would suggest that there wasn't a God. That's not quite what I think this verse is saying. I came to understand this passage in Romans when I engaged with a Christian apologist who's called William Lane Craig, who you might want to look at if you're interested in this sort of thing. And whenever he debates about the existence of God, he always starts with the question, why is there something and not nothing? And maybe think about that question for a second. Why is there anything at all? Why, like everything in existence, the whole universe, you, me, our whole world, and everything that's ever existed, why is there any of that and not just none of it? Not just nothing. I mean, it seems more likely that there should be nothing rather than something. So he always starts with that question. And to me, that is a very, very provocative question that I always come back to. When I'm having times where I start to doubt what I believe, or I think, is there really a God out there? I always come back to that question of, there has got to be a reason for the fact that there is something, rather than just nothing. You'd think if there was no God that there would be nothing. But the fact that there is a universe in existence tells me that there must be some kind of reason behind it. And I always come back to that idea. Now these things, Christian apologetics, these things can just remain ideas. So as it says, in your heart set Christ apart as holy. So when you think about good arguments for God, lots of people can have good arguments for God, but it doesn't really mean that it's gotten into their heart and that it really affects them on a heart level. So even if you're someone who wants to start thinking about the arguments for God, I would encourage you always to make sure that it's something which goes into your heart and doesn't just stay in your brain. Okay, so the second part of that verse is that we are to give a logical defense to anyone who asks. Now the point there is that this is about waiting till people ask what you believe. It's not about just going out and trying to pick an argument with anyone. That's kind of like, I think as you start to read apologetics and go, oh wow, yeah, there's a really good argument to be made for the things that Christians believe. It can be tempting then just to go out and find someone on the street and say, hey, tell me why you don't believe in God, and try and pick an argument like that. But that's sort of like, doing boxing training for months and months and months and like building up your strength and then deciding that you want to test out your boxing ability by just going out to the street and just punching a random person in the head and feeling like a champion. It's really not what this verse is talking about. It's actually waiting until someone asks you, hey, I noticed that you've got a different way of seeing the world, or I noticed that you're a little bit different, or is it, can you tell me? Or they might say, hey, if you really believe in God, then explain to me this or whatever. And it's about having a good logical defense when those questions come at you. Because sometimes those questions can come at you and you haven't thought about it yourself. And then you're kind of like, oh yeah, I don't know. And it can actually throw you off and you start to question what you believe. For me, I had a friend who, they weren't an atheist. That is, I wouldn't say that they just believed that there was no higher power, but they weren't a Christian either. They actually subscribed more to an Eastern way of thinking. And when we say an Eastern way of thinking, we mean basically a religious worldview which is informed by Buddhism or Hinduism. And we would get in discussions about belief, and what they would basically be suggesting is that they and I, or she and I, believed the same things, just with different names. So that Christianity and her sort of Eastern beliefs were basically the same thing, just with different names. And I really couldn't, that really stumped me to begin with. And so I did a bit of reading about it and thinking about it. And I read a guy called Tim Keller, who has has a book called The Reason for God, which you should take a look at. And that helped me to think about the difference between Christian faith and Eastern belief. And it became really important when this girl was going through a breakup, because she was in a lot of pain. She was in a lot of hurt. And I was actually able to go and say to her, because you see, in Eastern belief, they don't believe in a God. They just believe in what is sometimes referred to as the spiritual all soul, so that we are all one, and that eventually, if we can, I mightn't be doing this great justice, but if we can eventually detach ourselves from our own sense of self and our own desires, then we can escape negative karma and go into what is known as nirvana, basically their equivalent of spiritual paradise. Now that sounds lovely, and it's also, it's a great way of motivating people to do good and to be a good person. But when a time of suffering comes, like a breakup or a pandemic or whatever kind of suffering you might experience, it's not a lot of help just to say, well, we're all one and my sense of self is an illusion. That doesn't provide you any real great comfort. I mean, you can try and detach yourself from your suffering, but even if you tell yourself you're detaching yourself from your suffering, it doesn't really get to the heart of your hurt. And in reading about Tim Keller, he was able to point out to me that in God, in the Christian God, we have a personality. And it's not just a personality who's out there somewhere who doesn't care. It's a personality that came to earth and actually experienced suffering, even to the point of dying on a cross. And so in God, we actually have a person who is able to meet us in our suffering and understand what we're going through. And that's something that the Eastern religions and beliefs don't offer. And so I was able to come to her with that point of view and say, but this is why you need to have a personal God. That's what we mean, a personal God, and not just some idea of a spiritual reality. And I could see that in that moment, that she was actually able to start considering that. And more recently, she's been able to change, she hasn't converted to Christianity yet, but she's starting to see the importance of the Christian faith. And that's because in that moment when she was asking questions, I had thought through some of these things through Christian apologetics and was able to give her an answer. And the last thing is doing it courteously and respectfully. Okay, so apologetics is not about winning arguments, all right? Now, I think we live in a time when people are more interested in being right than they are in being effective. So it's not really that you care about the other person's life improving or whatever. You just want them to think that you're right. And so it becomes all about being right. Whereas we as Christians need to let go of the desire to be right, okay? We don't live and breathe on proving people wrong. We actually want to just see people come to know Jesus at the end of the day. And Christian apologetics is just one way in which we can help people do that. If people feel like we're just arguing with them, just for the sake of winning an argument, then they're not going to want to listen to us. That's the point where they'll start to dig their heels in and go, I don't care what you have to say. I just don't want to give you the satisfaction of feeling that you're right. When you get into an argument with someone and you forget what you're actually arguing about, all you know is that you just don't want them to win. That's what it can become like if we have the wrong attitude when we approach apologetics. It says in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 2, if I understood all of God's secret plans and possessed all knowledge, and if I had such faith that I could move mountains, but didn't love others, I would be nothing. So when we approach Christian apologetics, it's got to be from a place of love. We love other people. And in our love for other people and our desire to see them come to know the truth, come to know Jesus, we want to use apologetics and give them a good reason, good cause to find out more about it. And I think that sometimes when we are really argumentative, it can come from a place of feeling insecure about what we believe. And maybe we actually doubt what we believe, and so we want to just argue other people because we can't face the fact that maybe there are things that we don't know about. But I actually think that when you meet a Christian who is really comfortable in what they believe, and they know that Jesus is the truth, then those people are always comfortable to say, I don't know, when they're given a hard question. And if someone comes to you and says, hey, explain this to me, Christian, and you say, oh, to be honest, I don't know, that's a good question, I don't know the answer to it, and they can see that you're not completely thrown off course, then that doesn't say to them, you saying I don't know isn't saying to them, oh, well then what you believe is stupid. It's actually just saying, even though I don't have the answers for everything, I still know that what I believe is true in the depth of my being, and I'll have a think about that and get back to you with an answer. So as we discuss apologetics now, I want us to keep that attitude of it being all about love, and that saying I don't know is perfectly okay. Thanks.
Theo, that was so awesome. Thank you so much for sharing with us. We're super excited to see you on Zoom in 10 minutes. But before that, we are going to have a time of reflection. We're going to head into a time where we're going to play a worship video. And what we want you guys to do during that time is think about these questions. You may want to grab a pen and some paper and write these questions down, because these are the questions that we're actually going to be discussing in Zoom. So if you want to be prepared, then grab a notebook and a pen. And the questions are, what are some of the main reasons that people don't believe in God. What evidence is there for the existence of God? How do we know that Jesus actually existed? It is said that Jesus must either have been a liar, a lunatic, or Lord. What is meant by this? Why do Christians believe that Jesus is the only way to heaven? Can you be a Christian without believing in miracles? And that's all the questions. So be thinking over those for the next 10 minutes and then head over to Zoom. As usual, we'll have the Zoom details at the end of this video. So yeah, we'll see you there. Can't wait. Bye guys.
Singing, oh, Christ be magnified, just let his praise arise. Christ be magnified in me. Singing, oh, Christ be magnified at the altar of my life. Christ be magnified in me. No, I won't bow to idols. I'll stand strong and worship you. And if it puts me through the fire, I'll rejoice 'cause you're there too. And I won't be formed by feelings. I'll hold fast to what is true. 'Cause if the cross brings transformation, I'll be crucified with you. 'Cause death is just a doorway into resurrection life. If I join you in your suffering, then I'll join you when you rise. And when you return in glory with all the angels and the saints, my heart will still be singing, my song will be the same. Oh, my song will be the same, Lord. Singing, oh, Christ be magnified, just let his praise arise. Christ be magnified in me. Singing, oh, Christ be magnified at the altar of my life. Christ be magnified in me.